Excellent. All right, well, welcome and good afternoon. Thanks for attending. We're going to be talking today about PingFederate and PingAccess platform automation. So just a quick introduction to myself and my co-speaker up here. My name is Kevin Shanley. I've spent, well, in just a couple of years, I will have spent more time in identity and access management than I've done anything else in the rest of my life. So I'm kind of hitting that midway point in expertise. But I've spent really I feel like most of my life already jumping around country to country, doing these large-scale identity and access management deployments all around the world. In my free time, of which I seem to have very little, I do like to get out there and play a whole lot of video games with my boys and, and occasionally get on my bike. But who I'm also speaking here with is my co-worker, Subhodeep Ghosh. I call him just a whole developer extraordinaire because this guy is probably one of the greatest developers I've known in my entire life. We started working at CyberInc together, which was recently acquired by KPMG, and where he really wrote almost the entire thing, this CyberInc policy automation suite. It's become really a core function of a lot of PingFederate, PingAccess sales. We see it across the market. And I just wanted to also talk really quickly about how some of these tools fit together with this. When we actually became a part of KPMG, we forked this CPaaS product, the CyberInc Policy Automation Suite, and so it's now actually called with KPMG. It's the KPMG Access Management Orchestration Suite, or KAMOS, and Ping actually now has a fork or a variant of this called PingAccess Policy Migration. And this guy just got married. It's pretty exciting. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? Well, I want to cover really a lot of the basics of why we need to automate, why people run into problems with automation, go into some leading practices as we've gone and really done this at a number of really large customers. What are some of the things that you really want to be doing to have a much cleaner system overall? Subhodeep's going to come up here and then talk a bit about infrastructure, DevOps automation, and maybe a little bit of infrastructure as code. And from there, we're going to actually pull back and talk a bit about our KAMOS product, our Access Management Orchestration Suite, and have some fun demos. So when we think about automation, a lot of us really harken back to the times of 100 years ago, Henry Ford, the Model T, doing mass production, and the first real large-scale automation. And you think, well, if we've done this 100 years, then we must have it really down to a science. And the answer is not necessarily. So just looking at this use case here, we looked at a luxury car manufacturer, and they had fantastic cars, but they had literally such poor reliability that they became a punchline, became the butt of a joke. And it was something like you had to own two of them to keep one on the road because one would always be on the shop. And when they took a step back and really looked at what's causing these problems, it came down to really a couple of different things. Their cars had, well over 20,000 parts, way more moving parts than any other car out there or mass production car, 4 times more than its competitors. And it required over 400 man-hours to build, more than 10 times more than the most reliable car on the road. And the company was going under, so they got taken over. And as they went through and they said, okay, how do we not dilute the brand? And we'll make year-over-year iterations. We're going to reduce the number of moving parts. We're going to reduce the manual hands on the system. And we want to have a better product at the end. And as we go through this, and they went through this exercise, they didn't just see small gains. They actually produced substantially more cars, like twice as many cars, with over 40% less people. And within 15 years, they became the #1 most reliable car manufacturer. And this is automation. This is why we're here. It's not like they weren't automating before, but they were maybe falling into some of the pitfalls where automation can fall apart. And when we look at automation from the context of really IT, well, we start to see why DevOps has become really a hot subject in all of this. You know, we have all the typical bullet points of, hey, you know, it's more efficient, it's going to be cheaper, we're going to be faster time to market, and the whole thing will be more reliable. And that's generally what you always get with some form of automation. But when McKinsey looked at this, and they started studying things with agile programming, and they said, well, you know, it's not so much agile programming that's driving much faster time to market. It was when people started automating their DevOps operations, that they were taking these operations of, in that first graph on, I guess, well, my right, far left, they were saying, hey, when we have this, you know, we're looking at an average time of 100 days between finishing our code and actually getting it out the door. Once we'd automated those processes, you could get rid of 83 of those days, which just becomes a fantastic business story. Likewise, you know, just common operations, updating servers, getting that stuff out there, going from 100 days to 10 days, and you really start to see the power of all this stuff. But when we talk about security context, we really start to see even yet other things we can gain in. And it's, you know, with KPMG, we like to talk a lot about risk, and this is also a bit of a risk management story. Operational infrastructure security risks, you know, we talk about things like, hey, how do you ensure that those policies that were created are actually, you know, created with all the correct parameters? When you have people manually keying in this data, you know, it's very easy to click the wrong checkbox, to maybe, you know, not know what that parameter does, instead of having someone really go through and create a proper template of an application. Likewise, something that's become really a big thing in recent years is malware in an environment. And as we go across some of our more secure customers, especially things like federal government, they'll run into situations where they'll find malware on a single server. Well, once you find that, you really can't trust anything else that's in that same network area. You know, that malware could have infected other things. You could have a cuckoo's egg, little malware that's kind of waiting to wake up and infect. So as a policy, they'll actually go through and delete every single server in that same network zone and have to rebuild it from scratch. And if you don't have automation, how long would that take you? 6 months, you know, instead of 15 minutes? So it's becoming more and more important in a lot of different ways. Okay, so I'd like to kind of switch tracks from just kind of talking about why automation and talk about some leading practices for all this. So first and foremost, you need to standardize all your processes and make sure you have good processes before you actually try and automate them. Here we have just a little quick scenario of an application owner comes up and says, hey, I've got this brand new application and I need to, I want to pull this thing into single sign-on and have web access management. I need to get some infrastructure set up and everything. Oh, great. Well, sure thing, the web access manager says, but I just need you to fill out this 14-page questionnaire I have. It's a standardized process, and this is actually, this is not a fake story. That was at a real customer site, and it wasn't even at just one customer site. I've had this happen multiple times where you have a very technical SSO team, and you know, they want to give you lots of flexibility. They want to give you all kinds of options on how you can customize your application. But from the application owner's perspective, they'll look at things on this questionnaire and they'll just have no idea. You know, what's a SiteMinder realm cache going to affect with my application? They don't know. And sure, you've given them the opportunity to create the absolute best possible policy, but in actuality, you're really just kind of setting them up for frustration and failure. Likewise, we come across then this duality of automation and flexibility. You know, there's people want to be flexible, they want to be able to have all those options, but that is directly opposite of trying to automate a process. And having more variables into that process, it's kind of like the car factory having more hands touching and more moving parts. Those are all the areas where you're going to start to see failure. And so instead of trying to go and give total flexibility, let's look at it the opposite way and think of what are the minimum things we can offer an app owner, things that they can understand. And so in the context of an SSO policy, you know, what URLs do you want protected? What roles do you want to assign to those URLs? Like, these are things that kind of everyone gets out of the gate, and it becomes a really simple process then, and it sets them up for success. Maybe you're not offering them 100% flexibility, but what you are giving them is, so you're not necessarily getting the best type policy, but you're getting a really good policy. And because you're able to automate it all, it then will always work. And so, what if we were to take that same context and instead the SSO owner or the SSO team owner says, just kidding. Actually, I just need to ask you 8 questions. Once I'm done with those 8 questions, I'll be able to provision your operating system. I'll be able to provision a server, get that thing on the network, provision all the firewall ports, provision the load balancing, provision you an SSO policy, and we'll have you up and running in 15 minutes. And in fact, before you even get back to your desk, you'll have an entire infrastructure up there and waiting for your application to be installed. Did he get to really put a whole lot of questions or inject a lot into the process? No. But what he gets is really something that's going to work right out of the gate, and it's going to work reliably in the way that we would expect it to. So on this slide, well, we talk about nomenclature. And I can actually talk for hours on this one slide. I'll have to go fast because we only have 50 minutes. But this is one of those core things for policy automation. What's in a name? This is really, it's everything. So many problems are solved by how you set this stuff up. As a standard within KPMG, we set up, based on any sort of a container object, a top-level object, we like to have all of our dependencies in some way linked to that top-level container. Because what happens in 10 years, or I should say, what happens when you want to delete this policy? Maybe you were just setting up a quick little test and you want to go off and clean it up. Well, in the ping world, you can't start deleting from the bottom up. You have to delete the container first. Well, once you delete the container, you don't know what else is out there because that was the only thing linking the whole policy together. So 10 years from now, you're going to be full of policy orphans, all these junky objects all over the place. So we always like to have some sort of a context that pulls it all together. And just as a quick word, names should be searchable, descriptive, usable. And by usable, that can mean things like being short. Maybe the UI can't show a really long name. So you do want to be mindful of those types of things. And programmable. Based on how you actually want to use these names, be able to parse what an object is based on the name, it really makes a massive difference. Now, as we look at doing automation, there's this thing I like to call the carrot and stick. And automation is great unless people don't use it. And most app owners will actually come and think that they're unique and think, hey, this, it's all good and well that you can automate this stuff, but I want to do what I want to do. And hey, my application, it doesn't run on port 8443. We need to open up port 2732 in the firewall. We need to have all these exceptions created and open up separate requests. And we haven't really tested our app on later versions of Red Hat, so we need an older version installed. Oh, and we also want a bunch of other attributes. So, what's the answer to that? Well, sure, we can do it. But it's going to take you 5 weeks, and we're going to have a monthly surcharge on your team to be able to support this very custom implementation. We want to politely get people onto an automated platform, get them to use those things, but also be open and be flexible. There's no reason why we can't support it, but they should also feel the pain of having to have something custom in the environment as well. And something that can also happen quite a lot is a central service is just that. It's something that's shared by a whole slew of different applications, app owners, and such. If any one app essentially compromises the centralized service, it's a problem for everyone. And I've seen this happen in multiple customer accounts where essentially they'll come up and one app will demand all kinds of user lookups. They'll want to clear their cache every 60 seconds and redo those lookups so they always have the latest data available to them, but they don't want to do it themselves. Because they're like, for SSO, you guys are already doing this. You're already doing the lookups. Why not just do it for us? It's a couple of checkboxes, couple of configurations. This would be easy for you. And it is easy, except for the fact that this can drastically affect the performance of your system. And if you have one app that can essentially slow things down for everyone, well, you haven't created a very good centralized service. And so, really, you want to create something that's clean, be able to socialize this stuff out to your other app owners to say, hey, it's SSO. It's not everything in the LDAP directory. It's something, it's your unique identifiers, your username, your email, your unique ID. And if an app owner needs additional attributes on top of that, they can look it up themselves. And there's no reason why they can't do that. It'll keep everything clean and fast. And finally, on the best practice front, you really want to consider all your use cases. And this can actually branch out to way more than you think. So I already gave that one example of 10 years from now, how many policy orphans you're going to have. But also think about things like how supportable are these policies. One of the most common problems we run into when we onboard a brand new application is an app owner will call up and say, hey, we just changed some stuff and now we can't get to the app. We're getting these errors every time we log in and try and get over to the application. So then the support person, they have to say, okay, so what's your application name? All right, well, then I'm going to log into PingAccess. I'll find the app. Now I got to find the web session. Now from that web session, I can find where the OpenID Connect client is. I can go to PingFederate, look that up, figure out what went wrong. Well, because we've set up our nomenclature so that OpenID Connect, all of the objects in a PingAccess policy link back to that same app name, if they just give me the app name, I can go right to the end of that chain, look at PingFederate, search for the app, I'll find the right client connection and fix it. And so it can actually streamline your processes if you think ahead of how some of these flows will work. Okay, so with that, I'll pause and bring up Subhodeep to talk about Ping infrastructure automation.
Can you hear me okay? All right. So let's talk about typically, we have run into through. No? Is that better? Okay. All right. So when you want to onboard an app, typically you might have to raise several requests to the infrastructure team, middleware team, raise requests for firewalls, LTMs, and all of these teams work on their own, and it takes a long, long time. And as you would see, all these are interdependent. So like a load balancer team cannot complete their request if there are no web servers installed. These all leads to, very high time to market. It might take a couple of months, it might be more than that. And overall, it's really a bad experience from an application standpoint. Why don't we flip this, make something like infrastructure as a code, try and automate a lot of these processes. So as an alternative, we can have like a request onboarding where we would capture few details around app name, server details, what kind of RAM, CPU, environment, and then we can make various calls to the infrastructure, load balancer, which can, install the VM and do the load balancing schemes. And at the end of all of this, we KAMOS, which can generate all the policies for the SSO system, the agent bootstrapping. And this might be an automated way, but there might be certain customization which might be required. Now, this will get you like maybe 80 to 90% of the job done, and the rest of the customization can be done manually. But onboarding standpoint, it's much simpler, and the time to market reduces drastically. What we're going to do is take one of these boxes. Just we would see what does it really take to create a web access management policy in Ping identity, and how much of time does it really take. So typically, these are the various steps you would follow. Now, Ping is a highly configurable product, but they give you a lot of options. Not all the options are really needed, for a cookie cutter application. And this whole step, a DevOps or an admin setting it up may not know what each of those configurations might mean. It really involves logging into 2 different consoles, like you have to log into PingFederate, set up your OpenID Connect policy, your client, then go back to PingAccess, set up a bunch of objects, link them all together, and finally test the application. So what we're going to do is run through a quick demo, which would show what does it really take if you this app, all these objects manually. Just quickly. Oops. Okay, so here we log into PingFederate, try and create an OpenID Connect policy. Now this video is highly activated. It will go very fast. You would see a lot of options. This gives you an idea like the kind of complexity involved in creating a very bare bone policy which doesn't have any LDAP lookups. It doesn't even have resources. But you would see all the screens flickering really fast. You need to copy the shared secret. This is your OpenID OIDC client object. And then you have to go back to your PingAccess application, try and create the application. You need to create a virtual host, create your web session, then you need to put in the same secret, create an agent, and we ran through this demo a couple of times, and let me pause there. So you will see we just created an app from scratch, which probably doesn't do anything, and still we have an error out there. So we mistyped something. We probably mistyped the redirect URL, which leads to an error. So the point here is like there are a lot of options. So it's really easy to make mistakes. As Kevin was saying, if you make mistakes, it increases your time to market. It's really hard to troubleshoot. And we want to reduce a lot of these moving parts and try and streamline this whole process.
Great. So I think what was really interesting about this, we actually recorded this stuff last night. We weren't sure what kind of internet connection we would have in here to be able to do a live demo. So we're like, okay, we better record this stuff and make sure we can actually have it working. And we were creating this application manually. And at the end of the recording, like hit save, and then this yellow bar came up. And I was like, oh man, it didn't work. And then I thought, well, actually this proves exactly the point that we're getting by, that when you have a lot of manual interaction, a lot of variables, you have a lot of room for error. And that was just, it was like a case in point. Couldn't believe it. Okay, so that was our demo there. Let's start this. So we see then that trying to do this stuff manually is pretty painful. And that's just one policy creation, and it's a policy that doesn't even do anything at the end of the day. Didn't do any LDAP lookups, didn't even connect to an LDAP directory aside from the actual authentication. It doesn't do anything special with options, and it didn't even go into a lot of the submenus of options. No rules or anything tied to that thing. So even in the bog standard simple example, there's a lot of room for error. And so what we came up with was this, the KPMG Access Management Orchestration Suite, and we wanted to automate everything around policy lifecycle management. So that big circle in the middle there, it's really all the things you need to do from a policy, from the build, test, refine, promote, remove, and recover process. We wanted to have a whole series of one-click tools that removed people's hands from the keyboard, where we create a lot of these things automagically. And well, I say that, but there's no real magic to it. We do a lot of things with templates, and you'll see. We'll try and show the man behind the curtains of how this stuff works. But what it does do magically is it drastically reduces the errors, it drastically reduces the time to market, and makes your team much more efficient. And just starting off from the policy build process, we have kind of two different ways you can come in from there. We have a whole Web Access Manager migration capability, so we can actually bring in from CA SiteMinder apps or policies, from Oracle Access Manager 10 and 11G, and even a generic policy migrator. So if you wanted to export your policies to something like a CSV file, we can import that stuff right into PingAccess and PingFederate as well. Also, we have a simple one-click policy build process. What are those baseline things we need to know about a policy where we can actually just go ahead and create 80% of what you need, where you have a fully working policy, just with really a single click. Likewise, once you have that policy, what happens next in your workflow? If you hand that policy right off to your application owner, they'll go off, want to install an agent, try things out, and say, hey, this doesn't do what I thought it did. So we wanted to enable something around agile testing, the ability to test things offline, the ability to, that once we create this policy, let's make sure it does what it says it does, and be able to test that stuff in real time. From the policy refinement standpoint, that's actually an area where we don't have tools, or at least not yet. And that's kind of by design. If you need to make some really fine-grained changes, we didn't want to rewrite everything that's in the Ping administrative UIs, but there are some times you need to go in there and actually make some changes to things. Likewise, probably the single most used function is promotion. Because once you've created that working policy in dev, how do you take it from dev and push it to test and QA and production? And when you make those pushes, how do you make it seamless? Because when you export that dev policy, well, it's tied to a dev LDAP directory. It has dev host names. It has all sorts of things that tie it to an environment. So our tool will actually auto-transform all of that data as we export it and move it to different environments. And so as a result, we take all of that guesswork out of it. And because a lot of the times, the people who are making those changes, they didn't write the policy. They're just the guys who are, or ladies, who go and actually are pushing those things around. And a lot of times when it's production, it happens at Friday at 2 o'clock in the morning, and someone's working with just kind of half a brain cell, and all you can give them is a button to click, because anything that requires any sort of thought, you just can't do it when you haven't had any sleep. Finally, we have policy remove, policy recover capabilities. So policy removal, just as we said before, where you delete that top-level app container, everything else becomes orphans. We will delete that, take out everything else, have a nice, clean system with a single click. Likewise, someone accidentally clicks that button, or someone changes a policy, forgot how to get back, we have a whole version control database where we can actually go back to previous versions of policies, all with change control built in. And we also have a series of side tools. I won't go over them today, but it's, we have a whole heads-up monitoring dashboard, agents for WebLogic and WebSphere, and even an access gate for Oracle. How is our tooling set up? Well, we wanted to copy what Ping did in a lot of ways, because it's something that's going to work closely with their system. And so we wanted our customers to have a very similar type of experience with all this stuff. And we also thought that the Ping products are pretty cool, and, and it seemed like a great place to start. And I see a Ping product manager in here, so I'll give him a shout out. Okay, so how is it set up? Just like PingFederate, the entire thing is in a black-boxed Jetty Java application server. You literally unzip it, point it to Java, fire it up, and you're off to the races. Just like PingFederate, we went for an API-first strategy. We write all the APIs before we go and do any sort of UI, user interfaces or anything. And likewise, just like PingAccess, the whole thing runs on a flat file, self-archiving H2 database. We can further extend all these capabilities. And as much as we like to have our UIs and we think our stuff is pretty good, you'll see over here, actually I can use this pointer, that we have really the way a lot of our customers use it, they don't even use so much of our UIs. What they do use is they'll have things like Jenkins set up, and maybe there's a whole Jenkins workflow where it needs to go and get an approval from your manager and an approval from the app owner. And once it's got those approvals, it makes a simple URL RESTful call to our APIs, and it's all scriptable with curl or whatever, to be able to go in and, well, let's promote that application to production. We have all the change requests in place, everything's been approved. You know, why should anyone even have their finger on the button to do anything? So all that stuff is built in. Okay, so I'd like to show some quick demos around KAMOS, and what's our time? Cool, we have enough time. Around this stuff. So for KAMOS automation, we're going to start off with a one-click policy creation. This is essentially going to do exactly what you just saw Subhodeep's movie go through, where we went through and manually typed in all the data and still managed to mess it up. So fire up this movie. Okay, and so what you're going to see here is essentially we're going to go into our policy automation interface and really go and well, so we're logging in here, clicking policy create, and as I said, we wanted the bare minimum of information. So we need things like an app name. We need to choose a template. What sort of a policy are we going to clone? And we need to add a virtual host. And then we go off and create that. Oh, so it goes by pretty fast. And that's what we did. All that manual process where we didn't make a working policy at the end, that just happened. And we actually made a much more complex policy with LDAP lookups, with everything. It pushed it out to PingAccess, it pushed it out to PingFederate, it even pushed the PingFederate cluster. So that thing is actually live right now. And so that's really the power of automation, and that's kind of why we're here doing this stuff. It becomes really a game changer of when people have to go through and try and do a lot of this stuff manually, we wanted to make it simple. So from there, let's kind of slow this whole process down, and I'll take you through it a little more, with a little more sanity. So first up, here's our KAMOS main screen. With this thing, you'll see our policy automation tools, test tools, monitoring dashboard, our whole web access manager migration screen. Everything is API-based as well, so there's a whole Swagger interface beyond that. So we're going to go into our policy automation screen. And here you'll just see, this is our primary workflow application. And we can do things, take backups, one-click removals, be able to push policies from dev to test to QA to production. And so in this one, we'll just go through that create operation one more time because that went way, way too fast. So, you know, as I said, what do you need to create that baseline application? Well, the vast, vast majority of your apps, they share a lot of common components. Just about everything for OpenID Connect will be the same. A lot of the stuff for your web sessions will be pretty darn similar. And really, as you start going down, it's all pretty similar except for maybe virtual host, the resources or the URLs you're protecting. And so we wanted to really kind of narrow things down to that so you have a fully working app, but then also have some customizability so that you're not just getting the same darn app coming out the other side every time. So baseline, we need an app name. And we've already said that, you know, whenever we want to create an app, all those dependencies will be based on the app name, so we can create these constructs. Likewise, we're going to choose a template. And we can choose any kind of a template. Maybe this has certain LDAP lookups, like it's going to give you the email address and a unique ID. Or maybe we have a more complex template that's going to give you all sorts of private data or social security numbers and things. So you can decide how many templates, how complex, how simple you want to make your applications. And we can have all sorts of other things. Do we want to create a completely standalone app? Or do we want to have an application that has shared objects, like it has rules that other apps are also going to use? We can do all sorts of things around that, and that becomes that policy construct here, which are kind of our conflict management. And of course, you need a virtual host. That's kind of the baseline parameter of how PingAccess works. So once we go ahead and create that, we put in a host name and a port, create application, and it'll go off and create all those different bits. So now that we have this working application, we want to do some offline policy testing. This will go into our test tool. And from here, we just want to choose our application and just see what kind of HTTP headers it's going to produce. What LDAP lookups was it doing? So it was very simple, just as one resource. And you'll see here, we're actually going to start off using our impersonation context. So how does impersonation work? Well, we just put in a username, and we can see if the policy was going to be successful. I'll get my little pointer out here. Was the policy successful? What HTTP headers are we going to provide as a part of this? And you'll see then as well, we just tested all this. It's not running anywhere in the network. We just created that application. This test tool will actually instantiate itself as its own built-in agent, and we use the PingAccess Open Agent Protocol to be able to make those policy calls and pretend to be an agent on the network. So likewise, let's turn off the impersonate user. And one of the things I forgot to mention there is when we do impersonation, we don't just impersonate a user, we can impersonate any authentication scheme as well. Key problem around all this, hey, how do we test apps that have secure ID, that have tokens, that have things that, there's no way an administrator can test out in the same way that a user might have. So we can actually bypass all those things and test it just as if the user was logging in with those types of things. So we'll see that I actually logged in here with the wrong username and password. And even though this thing's not on the network, we can see exactly what the user would see. We can see all the OpenID Connect process flow. And so here it is actually walking through all those OpenID Connect steps where it's redirecting, going back and forth, and we see where things actually failed. So you can troubleshoot these things, once again, before you even hand the policy over to the app owner. And at the bottom here, we have even the capability to load test policies, where we can go in. This is just going to run a really simple load test. And it'll instantiate itself, pretend to be the application, and run a load test right within the PingAccess policy engine. It allows us then to go in and test things from even a load test perspective to say, hey, how well are those LDAP lookups going to look over time? What is the session revocation call? What's that going to affect my response time in the back end as it goes through and makes all these requests? So we can actually see what those effects are in real time without deploying on the network. So next up is our one-click policy backup. Fantastically useful function where a lot of times before we start going in and making any changes in dev, go in and make a quick backup. So you see, what do? Well, we're going to come in, we're going to search for the app, and this is in our dev environment, and we could do it in PingAccess, PingFederate, it could be OpenID Connect or SAML applications. And we're going to list all of our policy exports. So we just have one here. And you'll see that there's actually metadata we store around all this. So there's this 540, that's our index for this particular export. And as well, we have an export source and came from the dev environment. We have an export time and who actually exported. Because you're going to start to get a lot of these things, and you want to be able to keep track of them. This also means that as we go and push a policy from dev to test, we don't want developers or operators making policy changes in test, QA, and prod. We want to have one policy that's getting modified and fixed in dev, and as we push it, we want to push that same export, like that 540 export from one environment to the next, which means that you can now fill out change requests that reference that export and get approved based for that export and gets pushed into production with no one touching the system who shouldn't be. And then what does it take to create another export? Just click the button. It just backed up the application and all of its dependencies that are tied to it. Now we've got a second one here with its metadata. So one of the most important parts of this whole thing is policy promotion. What is policy promotion doing? This is how we take that policy, we export it from dev, we auto-transform it so that it's normally attached to a dev LDAP directory, it's attached to all sorts of dev virtual hosts, and we want to auto-transform this and push it into the test environment. So we're going to go ahead, choose that same Identiverse app, choose an export that we want to push forward. So that'll be the one that I just created. Maybe create a change request number around this. And then choose a target environment. So before it'll push, it actually asks me, so hey, if you want to push this into the test environment, I actually don't have enough information to push this in there because this app's never existed in the test environment. What virtual host? What's the web server name in test? And so once again, there's no magic here. We need to actually be able to input some of this information. But where the magic is around this is that we track all the mutable data of this type of an application push. And once you've actually pushed an app from dev all the way through to prod, you don't need to touch it again. And you'll see as we go through this. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the system test host name. So it'll be sit.identiverse.sap or something.com. And maybe we're tying it to a specific agent trusted certificate. It's a long-lived certificate. We want to make sure we choose the right one. We publish that app. And that app that we just created in dev and tested, it's now out there and it's live in the test environment. That's all it took to make that thing happen. And we go ahead, and if we were to click publish again, you'll see it's not asking us for certificates. It's not asking us for which virtual host, because we're storing all that mutable data on a per environment basis, and then we auto-transform and set it up as we go. And we don't actually just set that up and sync it. We sync it up with both PingFederate and PingAccess. So if we were to add even more virtual hosts in here, maybe more virtual IPs, all things like that, we don't just store it in our database. We would set it up as more virtual hosts in PingAccess. And if you're familiar with the OpenID Connect, the whitelists on the clients, we would sync that as well so that this policy is going to work absolutely everywhere. And we can decide how we're going to push this stuff. We're going to link, overwrite policies, and so forth. So one-click policy removal, pretty straightforward, also pretty important in a lot of ways. Likewise, we're just going to go ahead and choose that Identiverse app and go ahead and click the remove. It'll prompt us for, are you sure you want to remove this thing? And we do. We just created this quickie app for a test. And now that app and all the cleanup, all the dependencies, boom, it's all gone. And so it really kind of revolutionizes how all this stuff functions and the ability to quickly create, remove apps, everything. In this particular case, someone called up and said, hey, you shouldn't have removed that app. I was using it. Well, we can actually go into our audit database and be able to see everything that's happened as a result of this. We see that someone did call the remove app service, and we saw user.1 remove the app, and maybe they didn't have the appropriate change request to be able to do that. So we're able to track all this stuff and make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And as a result of that, too, we can actually just go right back in and recreate the app from a backup, and you're back up and running inside of a few seconds. OK, so what do we got? 7 minutes? OK, Web Access Manager migration. This one's a bit more complicated. And so what it's starting off at is we're actually going to do a SiteMinder migration here. We have an exported policy or set of policies from SiteMinder. And we're going to walk you through that process of what it takes to actually create that in PingAccess. So that's actually a live app that we're running. So we go into our WAM migration. As I mentioned, we've got 3 different migrators out of the box. We have a whole CA, SSO, SiteMinder migration. We have Oracle Access Manager 10G and 11G. And we also have a generic migrator for this. So just for this demo, we'll go through and pull this in. So how did this work? Well, in SiteMinder, they have an XML, XPS-based export capability. We're going to take that XML file, import it into our tool. That'll auto-transform it into Ping context. And we can show the statistics on that one and go and start actually migrating. You'll see at the top there's actually even a little wizard of taking you through this whole thing of select your SiteMinder domain, import the policy, and get the results. So we're going to go ahead and choose this demo application, policy domain. And so this migration is actually one of our earliest tools as well. And one of the keys of this thing was we wanted to be able to have something that was really step one was I wanted to see all the CA information and all of the Ping information on one screen. We've revved it multiple times to get it to the absolute minimum number of clicks we can do for this stuff. And so essentially with 4 bits of data, we can migrate a policy. First up, we essentially need to pull in an authenticator from CA to see how you authenticate to this. And just like the automated policy creator we have, the one-click create, we're going to use a lot of templates. So we don't want to create a policy that's really poorly formed on the other side. We want to use things that work really well with Ping. And so we have this context of using templates to create a well-formed policy and then add protected resources on top of it. And so in this particular policy, it has a protected app, an unprotected app, some group membership requirements, and we need to add a virtual host and a proxy site, because that stuff is not in the export. So we go through, it'll go and create all these various objects in SiteMinder. And at this point, then you actually have a completely working app, and it's even live. So you refresh that page, now there's a policy in the proxy, and you're able to go and access the unprotected page directly, and you'll be able to access the protected page, which should redirect to login and get in, and we'll see that that user actually was a manager as a part of this. Okay. So, let me bring this back up. Before I close, and we're just coming up on the end, we'll have maybe 1 or 2 minutes for questions. I did want to, well, I started this whole presentation talking a little bit about Henry Ford, Model T, and mass production. And we talked a bit about flexibility. You know, a lot of these automated tools, you know, if you give someone just a button and you press the same button and out the end comes the very same product, that's not necessarily going to help you so much. It's kind of like Henry Ford's old joke of, if you want to, you know, whatever color you want, you can have as long as it's black for our cars. And so that's maybe not so useful in a lot of use cases, especially when we're creating policies. We wanted to create a tool that gets you 80% of the way, that really takes care of a lot of those low-level activities where you have a lot of hands in the system. So how do you get to that last 20%? That's actually what's coming out in our next release, coming this fall, where we're enabling businesses and app owners with a whole self-service module. And so that we'll be able to create all the policies, get you all the way there with a working app, and then enable those app owners to complete the last mile of integration, where they can actually then go and, hey, add in a couple protected resources. We'll have a whole rules builder that gives a nice friendly interface to be able to add rules into that as well. So it's pretty exciting. It's a big development that's coming up. And I will close it there. So any questions? Yep. We do, okay, so the question was, do we ever use our test tool for automated monitoring or alerting? We do have our own monitoring dashboard. That's a real-time dashboard. It hits all of your PingFederate, PingAccess nodes. That's mostly going after the heartbeat and checking things like, hey, are your JSON web keys you know, all synchronized across all your nodes? Are your application databases that are in PingAccess, are they synchronized across all your nodes? We don't typically use the test tool for something like that, but is your thought that, like, if you're testing to see if someone's changed a policy and now it's broken something, or? We already check like the heartbeats for PingFed and for PingAccess, but there's the talks to try to do that for individual connections and individual applications, which is a pretty big ask. But that's why I was wondering if you guys did that. Not specifically, but it's very easy to do, because all of those user interfaces you see, there's a Swagger interface behind all those things. And I believe we have an internet connection here. Let me see if I can, I'll show you that really fast. So here are REST APIs. And if all of you are familiar with Swagger, you'll see that, you know, this is essentially where we have all of our API capabilities. And so if we wanted to do something like an application test, I'm not sure which API, so I'll just pick an easy one. But essentially, it'll tell you how to call our APIs. And when we go and set this up, oops, I'll try this out. Oh, it did, it already went. You'll see that we tell you how to call our APIs to get that response, and even how to call it from like a shell script, like a curl script, to easily do that. So you could script something that works like that. Yes? How did we performance test the policy? Okay, so the way that our load tester is working, and really the whole test tool in general, it's a custom agent built from the ground up. We're actually not using Ping's SDK agent to do a lot of this stuff. And so when we test stuff, we pretend to be a server on the network. And we communicate over Ping's open agent protocol. So we know what protocol messages that our custom agent needs to send into PingAccess and what the various responses will be and how to handle those responses. From the load test side, what is the framework we're using? It's a custom set of Java threads. It's not like we have JMeter or something, or Selenium or something like integrated in the back end. It's our own set of thread pools that will generate logins and responses.
To test your policies rather than testing the end application. So the load test is primarily to test your PingAccess policies. So if you write a rule and maybe that rule takes forever, you should be able to catch that.
Yes? Where the users are not familiar with Ping? Well, this particular console, it's to be used not by the app owners, but by the centralized SSO team and the operators. Now, when we release self-registration, that will be focused on application owners. And there's often a thing of people wanting delegated administration. And I have this whole song and dance of, no, you actually really don't want delegated administration, because you really don't want people who don't know Ping or whatever your web access manager is in those internal systems, and where they could break other things. There's too much complexity around all of it. And so what we really want to do is enable app owners to complete that last mile of integration, right? We want to automate everything we can, and for that last little bit, give them something simple that they can then run with to complete that. So that'll be a very targeted interface. Any final questions? I think we're running over time now. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for attending.